Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, everyone.
We are into 2024, so I hope that your new year is going good so far. We're only 4 days in, so hopefully nothing catastrophic has happened to start off the year.
You know what's weird is as you get older, time goes faster. I'm sure you've had other people say that, but man, it's just amazing how fast it goes.
Well, I'm feeling it myself.
Yeah.
I mean, man, maybe it's because we just get busier. I think that's it.
Well, I don't know. I'm not as busy as I used to be.
I don't know.
I only work 3 days a week, but
it's
still
true.
Time goes by really fast every week.
That's why that's why it's so important to just enjoy the moments.
Moment.
Yeah, right. And we've talked about this before, this idea that it's okay to look forward to what's to come. I think that's a good thing, right?
Yeah,
and
I do. Yeah.
But I mean, one thing I've tried to do as a parent is I've just tried to enjoy each stage that my kids are in so that I don't look back and miss that stage.
As you get older and as a grandparent like we are, it's actually pretty easy to do that. It's easier to do that because you don't have the day-to-day taking care of the kid.
Yep.
And so it allows you to focus more on when
My dad says that grandchildren are a parent's reward for not murdering their own children.
That's right. There you go.
So, and maybe one of the harder stages to enjoy could be the teenage stage,
which is what we're going to talk about.
Teens and privacy is the topic for today. So this is tricky because
yes, it is.
Teens need more autonomy and they need more control over their lives. They need less boundaries. They need more freedoms. And that can be really difficult for parents to navigate because every kid is different. Every situation is different. Every home life is different. And every family is unique. And, my dad said he tried his best to treat us all equally. But I don't know if that just really, I don't know, it just doesn't work because kids are different and they're going to be able to handle different things. So my family claimed growing up that I was the favorite child. I think I was just the easy child. They claimed I was the favorite because I had more privileges. I had more freedoms than they did, but I also earned them. So I think there's a difference between being the easy child and the favorite child. I think sometimes the easy child gets portrayed as the favorite. It's just, well, when you don't cause problems, you don't cause problems.
Right. And so one word we need to talk about is trust, because I think a lot of it comes down to trust. And then as I was thinking about what we might say during this episode, I think it's important for us for our listeners to realize we're giving some ideas. It doesn't mean, I don't know that I think I'm right about this necessarily.
Yeah.
I think that, as you rightly pointed out, it depends on the situation. It depends on the kid.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that one thing that is important is, and I think this is as parents relate to their teenagers, that always starts when they're infants.
Yeah.
It starts with attachment, and attachment and trust are tightly linked together. And so if you don't have good attachment with your children as kids and preteens or tweens, I guess they call it now, then I think that's going to make the teenage years a lot more difficult. And so for you parents out there who have young children, it's really your relationship with your teens starts when they're infants and kids growing up. Because that's where you build the trust and the attachment.
Yeah. And you build that by responding to their needs as best you can. Now, and it's not to say that you've ruined your trust and attachment because your baby was crying and you didn't realize it right away. That's not, it's a pattern.
Not what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's this pattern of consistently not meeting your child, consistently not being responsive to a young child. And,
Mhm.
this makes me think of when kids are like around 2 to 3 and their vocabulary just starts exploding and you can't keep up with it. I can't tell you how many times my kids have come to me and they're asking me for something. And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So many parents can relate to that. But the point is you're there and you're responding to them and
Mhm.
you're doing your best to overall meet their emotional needs. One of my favorite parenting quotes is there is no one size fits all parenting solution, and there's
Right.
no one single right way to parent. There are wrong ways to parent, certainly, but those are pretty small. The wrong ways really fall into that category of abuse, neglect, harm. Those are the wrong ways to parent. You're doing your best to meet your child's needs emotionally, physically, and if you're doing your best to provide for them and if you're teaching them right and wrong, then you're doing good as a
Mhm.
parent.
And so I think it's important for us to also talk about as we start this that we're really talking about situations where I think there's good attachment, it's good trust.
Yeah.
But if you have a situation where there is either abuse or neglect, then it's not going to work the same way at all.
Mm,
And
yeah.
as far as privacy and teams, this is always going to be that conflict. And so we aren't. That's not what we're going to cover
Yeah.
today. We're talking about parents and families where there hasn't been that abuse and neglect, and where there's pretty good attachment, pretty good trust already formed.
Yeah. Right. And so, it can be tricky. And I think the big takeaway from this episode is going to be no matter how hard you try, you can't control your teen.
That's right. You
if
can't.
if if they really want to do something, they're going to find a way. That doesn't mean that as a parent you're failing. It just means that your child is going to make choices, you know.
Right. And all you can do as a parent is really be clear about your expectations,
Yeah,
and then always be clear about the rewards or consequences.
exactly. And it's all about boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah.
Teenaging is all about the boundaries.
Hmm.
So, and I think setting the clear expectations early on. So, let's start off with the easy one and one that you should do early, and that's on devices. So,
Yeah.
computers, cell phones, tablets, any sort of electronic device in the home. I think it's important and crucial to set that boundary early on. And this is something you've mentioned time and time again. This is my device. I am letting you use it because
Right.
that sets the expectation. This is not private for you. This is not your own private device. I have access to this. So anything that you are texting, sending, anything that you are doing on this device, I have access to it.
I think we need to go into that a little deeper. This is going to be complicated, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
So you're right. I've said before, I think it's a huge mistake because usually if parents give a phone or let a child use a phone, they're the ones paying for the service. I mean, the
Yeah.
child is not paying for the service. And so I think it really is important because you may want to be able to use the phone, say, as a consequence, and so
Hmm.
if you say this is your phone, it's hard to say, well, I'm taking your phone away. But if it's your phone anyway,
Yep.
then I think it makes it easier. So privacy and secrecy, I think we had to, talk
Yeah.
about that as we talk about how do parents handle phones
Hmm.
or computers or social media. So as you said at the start, teenagers, it's all about autonomy,
Hmm.
and I think as parents we want to be able, at least for me, I always wanted to be able to raise, functioning, self disciplining adults.
Yeah.
And so the only way you do that, the way you do that as parents, I think, is you teach them and you teach them about boundaries.
Hmm.
So with teenagers, I think the first thing we need to do as parents is we need to talk about it.
Yeah.
You need to have a good conversation and be able to outline what are the boundaries.
Hmm.
Now, I think that's really important because you're going to help your teenagers learn about, what are the boundaries they can set for themselves as they go out into the world.
Hmm.
What we're doing is we're creating an environment where we teach them how to be functioning adults. And part of that is I'm going to give you some freedom because that's what they want, right?
Yeah.
I mean, teenagers want to think that they're adults and they're young adults and they want more freedom. But as you said, in your family, you earned that. I think the way you earned that is probably through trust. Your parents trusted you, right?
They, yeah, they did, and they trusted me to make good decisions. And
Right.
you know,
But the only way they knew that is because you did.
yeah. And I came to them when I did make mistakes. So I
Mm,
still remember my dad handling this situation really, really well. And this was totally irrational on my part. But my parents had very clear expectations around dating and
mm,
boys. And I
mm,
wasn't to exclusively date boys until I was 16.
mm,
And so I was out with the boy, and he invited me to ride on the handlebars of his bike, and he had his arm around me, and we kind of had this sweet cuddly moment. And I was terrified my dad was going to somehow find out. He wasn't going to, but in my 13-year-old mind, 14-year-old mind,
uh-huh.
however old I was convinced that he was going to find out, and I was terrified, and I knew I would be in so much trouble if he found out. And so I went to him and I told him, and I was terrified that he was going to be just angry, and that I was going to have all sorts of consequences. But I knew it would be worse if he found out if I didn't tell him. And
Hmm.
I didn't get any trouble at all. I was shocked. He said, "Okay, well, this is why I have these rules," and he made it kind of a moral thing for
Hmm.
me. And that was the end of it. And
But
from then
but
on, and so this established trust. Both my dad knew that I wanted to make good decisions, and I knew that if I made a mistake, I could come to him and I could tell him.
okay, see, you're pointing out a really important thing, and that is that foundation
Yeah.
of you being able to go to him was that didn't just happen when you're 13. That
Hmm.
happens as you're growing up. And so it goes
Yeah.
back to what I said is that parents, you've got to be able to have that, you've got to be able to engender that type of relationship with your children where they can come to you
Hmm.
because that's what you want. And
Yeah.
so I mean, you're bringing up a lot of really important points. And that is, for instance, drinking with my kids. You can't control drinking. And so I said, if you had too much to drink and if you had any to drink, when you're in high school, then you need to call me and I'll come and drive you home, figure it out. And
Hmm.
so, to be able to say, I'm not going to get really angry at you. So if parents find out their kids have either, let's say, had something to drink, or maybe they're using cannabis, and if your response is immediately to get angry and ground them or something like that, then the likelihood that they'll come to you after that is not very high.
Hmm.
And so you want to have that relationship where your kids can come and talk to you. Now, so if we go back to privacy and secrecy, so let's try and I was thinking of some examples. So, for instance, in dating, you brought up
Hmm.
dating.
Hmm.
As parents, we never give up that right, I think, to make sure our kids are safe.
Yes.
So this is where it gets really tricky, I think, is the
Yeah.
balance between privacy, secrecy, and safety.
Hmm.
And there's no clear line
There
that I
isn't.
can see. And so as parents, what you see, how your kids are behaving, that type of thing. But so dating, I think it's important. I think as parents, we have the right to know who our kids are with
Hmm. Yeah.
and where they're going
Hmm.
and like time frame of when they're going to come home. I don't think we have the right to know what are you talking about. I think
Hmm.
generally we have the right to know what they're doing, but as far as what you talk about with your friends, I think that's privacy, and
Mm.
I wouldn't call that a secret at all. But I think to know who our children are dating, what they're doing, but what they talk about and their feelings for the person. I think even if they're out with a group and maybe your child has a crush on someone, I don't know that I think that's a private thing
I
until it
agree.
becomes say more like they're dating more seriously. So again, it
Hmm.
depends on the situation. But I think it's really hard to distinguish between privacy and what you need to know as a parent. Now, there's some, I guess, some psychologists who work with kids who would say that as parents, we don't have the right to go online and see what they're talking about. I personally disagree with that. So again,
Yeah.
here's one of those things where I don't know if it's right or wrong. And I
Hmm.
think as parents, you're going to have to figure out, what is going to work in your family. But I would never do it behind their back.
That's
I
a good
would,
point. Yeah.
and here's the reason that I think that parents really need to think hard about social media, computer use. I have seen a lot of bad situations come up where kids get caught.
Hmm.
For instance, kids, we have to realize, of course, we said this many times, their frontal lobes are not fully developed. They're impulsive.
Hmm.
They aren't making, sometimes they aren't making good decisions. It's so easy to get wrapped up with someone online and you don't know who they are
Yeah.
in social media, right? I mean, it could be a predator. But
Hmm.
I think the predators out there are really good at masking who they are. And so I think you have to be really careful as parents. And I'm talking about this as one who never had to deal with it. None of my
Right.
kids, and I can't remember if social media even existed. It probably did. But even now as adults, I only have one daughter who does any social media and the others don't. So I never
Right.
had to deal with it. Now you're going to have to deal with it. Have you and Curtis talked about it? Or maybe you already are.
Well, so our oldest is 11. And so we've, I guess you might say, dipped our toes into the world of social media in that. So, because Facebook has an app called Kids Messenger that we have allowed our kids to use. And Kids Messenger is great because there's so many controls on it. We can go in and we can see the messages they're sending and what they're receiving. We can see their pictures. We can basically see everything that they're doing. So we have full access to this account. But it's a really great way for them to contact people. So, and the reason why we did this is because our oldest is 11 and friends are starting to become very important to her.
Right.
And so she wanted a way to be able to communicate with her friends outside of school. And so Kids Messenger has allowed us to do that. Now, some of the boundaries that we've set and what we've told them from the get go is this is not private. Kids Messenger, we have full control over this. We have control over who you are talking to. And that's really important at this young age. Now, in terms of having like some sort of a social media like a Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, those kinds of accounts, I mean, I have mixed feelings on this. Right now, I feel like our kids are too young. And certainly our 11-year-old, I don't feel like she needs a social media account. If she has a friend she wants to communicate with, and I think that's really what social media is all about. It's all about being able to connect with people who you can't see, and I think Kids Messenger allows that. So maybe that's another thing that parents should think about is what are your kids wanting to do? What are they trying to accomplish with their social media account? Is it just connecting with friends? Because there are safer ways to do that that don't involve social media. Another thing that I think that parents have to explain to their children, social media and the internet in general is not private,
Right.
no matter what.
Oh,
And
yes.
no matter what you try to do, it's not private. And that doesn't necessarily mean that mom and dad are going to be able to find out, but somebody can. There's no way to make it private. And so once they put it out there on social media, it is out there. Or once they put it out on the internet, that's it. It's there forever. And
And
so,
it'd be nice if you could say to your daughter that she could trust her friend, but
yeah,
she doesn't know that,
no,
and so it's important that if she says something to her friends, that then it's out there. You're right.
yeah, yeah.
So I have a question for you.
Hmm.
If so, at 11, it makes sense what you're doing. Could you imagine that if your daughter's 16 or 17, would it become more private?
Hmm.
And you may
Um,
not have an answer to that, but what I'm pointing out is there's certainly we have to take into account the kid's age. I think we have
yeah.
to take into account the trust level, like we talked about,
Hmm.
with
Yep.
you and your parent. And so there are different factors.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you trusted your daughter and if she were making good choices, could you ever see yourself at 16 or 17? So I'm talking older,
Yeah.
that her communications might be more private.
Again, I think it really just comes down to trust
Hmm.
and I guess what she has done in response, right? And so I think another thing that parents need to be thinking about and talking about, and hopefully you already are, and that is your morals, right? Your
Right,
moral
right,
boundaries.
right.
So, so you need to obviously be having this conversation with kids around drinking and sexuality. Those are kind of the big ones.
Hmm.
And so, and
Or
it
any
is
substance use, any
any
type of
substance
substance.
use,
Yeah.
yes, and explaining to them. So educating them. I think education is going to be a really big important piece in this, and explaining to them your brain is still developing. I think that is crucial, is to tell kids you might see teenagers drinking, and putting all morals aside, tell your kids that it is not good for your developing brain to partake in these substances. it can damage your brain permanently,
Hmm.
and teach them the consequences of this. And then also what can be a little more tricky is around sexuality. And
Right.
and again, this is going to vary from family to family, and this can be really, really tricky because I know a lot of parents, and and I fall into this category of, we are teaching our kids our morals, which is no sexual relationships outside of marriage.
Hmm.
So that can be really tricky to navigate as they get older and as they get into that realm of dating. And parents want so badly for their kids to adhere to those morals that they are teaching. And it can be really hard when they realize that their kids aren't. And that can make them want to pull in more control. And so,
Yeah.
kind of where I'm going with this to tie back to your question is, I'm thinking of an instance where, maybe we're teaching our daughter that we don't want you having sex until you're married. And then she has a serious boyfriend and we're worried that she's having sex with him. Does
Hmm.
that give us the right to then start snooping through her phone, or to start going through her text messages, or something that might be private, to find out if she is maybe having sexual relationships? I don't
Hmm.
know what the answer is to that.
I
I don't,
don't know either. That it's important to realize that you can't you said it at the start. You
yeah,
you cannot control your kids. All you can do
yeah,
is teach them.
mm-hmm,
And I do think it is as parents, it's our responsibility to convey whatever moral values we have, and
yeah,
realize. I think you and I both realize that that's different, across
mm-hmm,
families, and so.
sure,
But I think it's important to convey that, and then you can't control your kids. All you can do is teach them.
mm-hmm,
But I think, and again, it depends on the age. As the kid gets older, so 16, 17, 18, and they start making choices, you have to decide as a parent, is that,
yeah,
do you, are there consequences to that or not? I mean, it's very tough.
mm-hmm,
There's
yeah,
there's no right, there's no easy answers to this. But if we go
there,
back to privacy,
mm-hmm,
what I keeps coming up for me is that parents need to have a dialogue with their kids,
yeah,
almost not continuous dialogue, but often you're talking about it, talking about what the expectations are. And so I think there are some things that ought to be private. If your child has a diary,
yes,
I think it's really important that they have a place where they can feel safe to write down anything. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention too, back when we were talking about social media, is, one of the most important things for our kids is their peer group.
yeah,
And parents have very little to do with how our children choose their peer group.
yep,
And that, boy, I was lucky. All four of my children had great peer groups growing up, but that is often not the case. That's the other reason that I think we have to be careful about social media, because you can get involved with a whole different peer group, that
mm-hmm,
pulls you in. I want to mention another thing that I've certainly mentioned before. I think every parent should watch the Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma. I think
mm-hmm.
it's really important to see that, and it'll hopefully change your mind or your attitude about social media and giving your children free reign on social media. I think that's a mistake. Now, some parents do. I think it's a huge mistake, though, nowadays.
And social media is so prevalent that I think one way or another, kids are going to find their way onto it. And
You're right.
if
You're
you,
right. There are so many platforms now.
Mhm. So, and keep this in mind, you may say no social media in my house, period. You're not allowed to have a Facebook account, but you can't lock them in your house forever. They might go to a
Right.
friend's house, or they might be at school. They might establish an account behind your back.
Yeah.
And so then you're getting into the realm of secrecy. They're keeping
Right.
secrets
Right. Right.
from you, and that can be dangerous. So, my thoughts on this and what I'm intending to do is, Curtis and I haven't decided on an age, but eventually we will allow our kids to have a social media account, and we're going to create it with them,
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to be friends with them so we can monitor what they're doing and just be open about it and say, okay, I want you to be able to do this, but I want to keep you safe, and really come at it from that angle of, I want to be able to see what you're doing, and I want to be involved and see who you're talking to and who's friending you. And it's about your safety. And so I think if you can really focus on that, that's going to foster trust. And your kids can't show you that you can trust them if you don't give them the opportunity. Now, that can be scary because means they're going to make mistakes.
I
So
agree.
it can be tricky. It can be challenging because
Hmm.
they're going to make mistakes and maybe they choose wrong. And so hopefully you are giving them those opportunities early on and in safe ways,
Yeah.
right?
And so I think as our children get older, 15, 16, 17, 18, I think
Mm-hmm.
that you have to eventually be able to give them more freedom.
Yeah.
I think because you don't, if they go off to college or they, leave home or what you want them to be able to, I call it being self-regulating. And
Mm-hmm.
the only way they know how to do that is by us as parents giving them opportunities
Yeah.
to be self-regulating. And again, we go back to that word you used earlier, my favorite word is boundaries. And
Mm-hmm.
you're helping them to learn what are some appropriate boundaries that they can set with
Yeah.
the outside world. So yes, it's true as a parent, you're setting expectations or boundaries with them, but I think it's a teaching moment to say, here's what you can do, to
Mm-hmm.
set those boundaries as you move out into the world.
Yeah. And as you are teaching kids your morals, also educate them, like we talked about before. So, as you're teaching them your morals around sexuality, you also need to
Right,
be educating them on why it is important, right? So, what are the consequences of
right.
having sex? And make sure you're
Hmm.
talking about pregnancy. You need to talk about how it happens, about how it's prevented. And, I think parents in a religious setting that can really scare them to talk about that, to talk about, oh, how you can prevent pregnancy because maybe they're going to go do it. Well,
Well,
you can't stop them from having sex. So,
right. And the research is pretty clear on this,
yeah,
that talking about it does not increase the child's likelihood of being sexual. I mean,
right.
and the same
Yeah,
thing about drugs. You could say exactly the same thing. If I talk
yeah.
about drugs or if I talk about the problems with drugs, am I then increasing the likelihood that they're going to go try it? And the answer is no.
Hmm.
And it's very clear that it's much better
Yeah.
to talk about it and talk about sexuality. And to
Hmm.
even now, I'm going to say this, and I have no idea, I'd be interested in what you're going to say about it. That with your children, to be able to say, here's my moral values, here's my expectation.
Hmm.
If you do decide, then you need to use protection. See, I
Yeah.
think that's really important because it's worse to either get a sexually transmitted disease or to get pregnant.
Hmm.
Is much, much worse. I mean, I'm not, I don't want to put you on the spot, but that's a hard one for some parents, especially I think in that religious setting, to offer that up as an option because often kids don't know that it is an option. They're just going to get caught up in the moment and have sex, and they have unprotected sex, and if they get pregnant, it just takes the one time. That's you just go down this road that is
Hmm.
really, really much, much worse. So I
So,
think again, the evidence is pretty clear that if you talk to kids about, because you're raising this kid from infancy, the trust, the
hmm.
attachment, and to say, I trust you to make good choices, but I want you to be safe. See, I
Yep.
think it falls into the category of parents. We need to keep our kids safe.
Hmm.
And so for me, I'm a real advocate for that. But you don't have to answer that question, but you can if you want to. And plus, you're ways off from ever having to make that decision of what you say to your daughter.
Well, I mean, we're only a few years off. I mean, she's
Yeah,
11 now.
yeah,
And so, I don't think I am actually that far off because as soon as girls start menstruating, they
right,
can get pregnant. And so
right.
you need to be having that conversation then. They need to
Hmm.
understand and they need to know. Now, in terms of the way my parents did it, I think my parents never told me if you are going to use protection because I think that felt too much like a go ahead to them.
Uh huh.
And,
Yeah.
but what they did tell me and what they did explain that I think I want to do is that I'll do with my parents is explaining how relationships develop and why they develop that way. Kind of just the cycle, the natural cycle of a relationship. As you
Hmm.
grow closer together, you're going to have those desires. And the safest way is to just avoid putting yourself in situations where that can happen. And so I
Right.
think that's a safe way to go about it. But again, teenagers and their prefrontal cortex is underdeveloped. And,
Right.
I think back to when I was a teenager and how close I came multiple times when I had a serious boyfriend to having sex,
Hmm.
despite my morals that I very firmly believed in, and despite the fact that my parents instilled in me and they did all the things, and I still came close to that.
Hmm.
And, again, I don't know that there's an easy answer, and I think it's going to depend based on my children, but I do think that it is important to talk to kids about how pregnancy is prevented and how
Yeah.
STDs are prevented. And
Right.
you can explain to them, this is my moral and this is what I believe. And you just say, I want to be very clear with you. This is my expectation. My expectation is that while you are living in my house, you will not be sexually active.
Right. Right. I
And
think that that's important to talk about.
it is. And so if it happens that you are sexually active, then you need to decide, is there going to be a consequence? What is that consequence going to be? And you need to be explicit and open with that with your children. Now, here's the hard part is if your children know there's going to be a consequence, they're a lot less likely to go to you. Now, the thing is with sexuality is, oftentimes a teenager's first sexual encounter, it may not have been planned. It
Hmm.
may have happened in the moment. And if you as a parent just try to put more control, more boundaries and say, "Oh, you've had sex with this person, you can't see them ever again." That's
Yeah.
not going to work because
No.
you can't
You
lock your teen in
can't
your house.
can't control them.
Yeah, you can't control them. And so that is something to keep in mind is if your teenager becomes attached to somebody and they're in a relationship with that person, I mean, just recognize that just telling them you can't go see this person anymore isn't necessarily going to stop them.
No, I mean, think about hormones. I mean,
Yeah.
hormones are so strong. And
Hmm.
remember, I'm reminded of Robert Sapolsky. I think we talked about him. No free will. That
Yeah.
idea that our behaviors, which I don't believe. I've said
Yeah.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
before. But I think that what it does is it speaks to how strong the influence of hormones
Hmm.
is on our behavior. And I think that's especially true with teens because
Yeah.
it's very strong. The hormonal component's very strong, and then the ability to make at times good rational decisions is not there.
Hmm. Yeah, their prefrontal cortex, the
Yeah,
decision-making part of their brain, part of their brain that
right,
self-regulates is not developed.
right.
So, teens are hard.
Yeah,
That's our episode in a
they are. But
nutshell.
so hopefully what we've done is just had brought up some ideas for our listeners to think about. But really, I don't know that either you or I think we have the answers to this.
No.
But maybe the takeaway for me would be talk to your teens about it. You've got to have an
Hmm.
open dialogue and realize that your relationship with your teens starts
Yeah.
when they're infant. I
Yeah.
really believe that.
Yeah. And so another thing that I want to talk about before we wrap up is going through their room.
Right.
So I think that, that really falls into that category of safety versus their need for privacy.
Right.
So again, and that's kind of falls into the cell phone is, this is my house. And if I'm concerned about your safety, then I'm going to go through your room. But again, I don't think, like you said, you do it behind your teen's back. I think you
Yeah.
tell
I
them,
think I think let's go do this together.
yeah, yeah, I am
If
concerned about you, your
Yeah.
behavior. I'm going to go through your room because I want to know if you are keeping inappropriate things in my house.
Right. And so I also think it's important for parents pay attention to how your kids are behaving.
Hmm.
Don't just turn a blind eye and like if you think, oh, this is weird, then follow up on it. If you have like this reaction, oh, there's something not right, don't dismiss it. Follow
Yeah.
up on it
Yeah. Yeah. I
and
mean,
and talk to your teens about it.
right. And it could just be as simple. I've noticed this.
Hmm.
What's going on?
What's going on? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think another thing that I want to say is just reacting in anger when your teen does break a boundary or when they break the rules, reacting just in anger and blowing up at them is not going to help. So parents really work on just tempering your reaction. Now, that doesn't mean you just say, "Oh, okay, well, you made a mistake. All right, fine, whatever." It's okay to express, I'm not okay with this behavior." That's
Right. Right. But as we've talked about it before, I really think it's important if parents have very explicit expectations
Mhm.
and they've talked to the teens about the expectations, and then they have either consequences or rewards, and they've talked to their teens about that, then I don't think you need to get angry. I think
Yeah.
you can just say, you know what, we talked about this. This was the expectation. Here's what's going to happen. And so I think the anger often comes because we haven't talked about it and we haven't set the boundaries. That's why I go back to the dialogue is really important for parents to think about what are my expectations and what are the consequences, and to have that conversation with your teen, I think is really, really important.
Yes, it's going to save you some headache, but it's not going to save you all headache because,
No.
I mean, teens are going to inevitably do something you didn't think about and you didn't talk about.
Yes.
Keep, keep
My
that
kids
in.
did that.
Yeah.
My kids certainly did that. But again, if you react in anger, then
it doesn't foster trust.
No.
And above all, you want your teen to trust you, and you want your teen to be able to come to you and when they need help, when they are in that situation. And so, teach them, educate them. It is not okay for you to drink while you are living under my house. It is not okay for you to be sexually active when you're living in my house. If it does happen, I want you to come to me so that I can help you. We will put the consequences aside in the moment or whatever, but let your teen know your safety is more important to me than anything.
Right.
And I want you to come to me when you are in trouble.
Right.
And if you react in anger, they're not going to do that.
That's right.
Okay. So teens are hard. Good luck.
Yeah, best of luck.
and I mean that in all seriousness. I don't mean that sarcastically.
No, and I'm serious about it too. I'm just glad I'm not there anymore. I don't have to worry about my oldest grandchild is 11 as well, and I don't have to worry about it. Their parents have to worry about it.
Yeah. Yep. And that's another thing that I think I want to bring up. I know we're running out of time, but I think this is something that is really important. And that is parents of teens, don't be hurt if your teen finds somebody else besides you to confide in.
Yeah, I agree.
So, if your teen is struggling, and I went through a pretty dark period when I was a senior in high school, and I just wasn't in a good place. And for me, it was a leader at church who I really connected with. And man, that woman was instrumental in helping me through that dark time. And my mom handled it really well. And, as a teenager, I didn't like my mom at all. She drove me crazy, absolutely crazy. We have a great relationship now and we really love each other and we talk all the time. But she drove me nuts as a teenager. And she was so desperate to help me that she called somebody who she knew I would talk to. And so, parents, if your teen has found somebody, an adult that they trust, that you trust, that can help them, take it. Just let them do it.
Yeah.
Okay. So next week, we are going to talk about self-boundaries. So you're probably wondering what that is. And it's similar to regular boundaries, but it involves yourself.
Okay, good definition there, Liz.
So stay tuned. We will see you next week, and I will explain it then. So,
okay. Have a good week, everyone.
Bye, guys. Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.